I should say, I should start with saying that, well, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends and colleagues, we're very happy to welcome at the online ephemeral April conference a very distinguished guest of ours, Professor Jayson Bраунли of the University of Texas at Austin, with the very important presentation on understanding democratic breakdowns and authoritarian onsets, 1989 and 2018. I should repeat that we are very lucky, at least, to have Jayson online, because this was our second attempt. The first attempt was a year ago, more than a year ago, to invite Jayson Bраунли to participate and deliver a honorary lecture at our previous April conference, and there was the problem with the visa. We tried again and planned Jayson's presentation during this April conference, and there was the problem with COVID-19. And we very much hope, I can repeat this, that we would very much welcome Jayson's visit to HEC with the with a lecture offline or a short course on the issues which are extremely important, as all comparativists know. I'm not going to introduce even Jayson Bраунли, because all people who are interested in comparative authoritarianism know Jayson's publications and Jayson's works. In the first place, Authoritarianism in an Age of Democratization, 2007, Democracy Prevention, the politics of the U.S.-Egyptian alliance, 2012, and the Arab Spring, Pathways of Repression and Reform, 2015. I can only say and add that during my courses, I not simply quote Jayson Bраунли, but I request my students to read at least parts of Authoritarianism in an Age of Democratization as a sine qua non. Pour les connoisseurs, I should simply add that we are very much welcoming to learn from Jayson, and we hope we will continue our relations, and we very much want you to be with us at HEC to deliver a course or whatever you wish. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation, and the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you, Andre, so much for the original invitation and the repeat invitation this year. And I definitely hope and look forward to being able to join you all actually in Moscow on a future occasion. And also want to thank Anna for all of the help with logistics and various different rounds of planning this and all of the emails. So I've been looking forward to this, and I'm gonna also look forward to the question and answer and discussion. I have a quick technical issue to address here in my office, that my cat just burst through the door, and I'm gonna push her out of the door and close the door so we have quiet. Okay, all right, everybody, I'm back. All right, so the topic today is the breakdown of democracy and the onset of authoritarianism. And what I mean by that is that you have democracy, a basically minimally democratic system, as political scientists tend to define it. It stops being democratic, and it doesn't just bounce back and become democratic again within a couple of years. You have the start of a new authoritarian regime. And this is the beginning of a larger project, so I really look forward to your your remarks and suggestions. But just to frame this puzzle, let's see if I can move something out of the way. Here we go. So to frame this puzzle, we can think about the current discussions about whether democracy is in crisis. And I would say this discussion, at least in American political science, has really picked up over the past 4 years or so. But it's driven by cases like Turkey, where Recep Tayyip Erdogan was originally, he became prime minister in a competitive multi-party system that political scientists consider to be democratic. But by summer 2016 or so, he had really entrenched himself and was looking like an authoritarian ruler rather than a democratic ruler. And at this point, I think pretty much all of the major political science cross-national data sets, as well as the qualitative literature, describes Turkey and classifies Turkey as being not democratic, as being authoritarian. Here's Erdogan shortly after the coup, the attempted coup against him that was foiled, and that led to him really pushing back on all kinds of critics in society in really establishing a pretty entrenched regime. However, this is only part of the story. And one of the things I want to kind of bring our attention to is the other half of the issue, which doesn't get much attention. So here's the president of Ecuador from 2007 to 2017, Rafael Correa. So Rafael Correa was president of Ecuador and operated very much in a kind of Hugo Chavez mold. He pursued leftist policies, and he got rid of term limits while he was in office. He did that through legal means, but that tends to be can be a step toward democratic breakdown these days. And people were very much concerned that Ecuador would go the way of Venezuela. I would say Venezuela, like Turkey, is one of the major exhibits of democratic breakdown in the early 21st century. But here's Correa in May 2017, after having stepped down peacefully. He didn't entrench himself like Erdogan. He didn't establish authoritarianism in Ecuador. And he stepped down at a point, according to the Telesur article that I used for this photo, with 62% approval. So he was still pretty popular, and yet he abided by pressures within his party to step down, to not have a third term, and he peacefully passed power to a successor who has steered the country in a different policy direction, although he's from the same party. And so we see here the contrast that merits explanation. Why are some chief executives subverting democratic rules, like in Turkey, while others are abiding by them? Or to put a kind of fine point on it, why are some democracies turning into autocracies, like Turkey, while others, like Ecuador, are persisting as democracies? And to answer these questions, one of the things that I've just been doing at the start of this project is to look at where democratic breakdown is actually taking place among the broader population of countries. In fact, the full universe of democratic cases. And what I find is that Turkey, Venezuela, Russia is another case that political scientists talk about. These are the exceptions, not the rule. So for those who are concerned about a crisis of democracy, one of the takeaways from my talk today is that it is something worrisome where it is really happening, but in terms of democratic breakdown and actually the start of authoritarian regimes, it remains relatively infrequent. And so that actually, for those who are concerned, may be an encouraging lesson. So where I want to go today is get a little bit more into the literature and the popular discussion about democracy being under threat and authoritarianism making some kind of dramatic comeback. I think a lot of these works are are more nuanced than their titles may imply, and they have some careful arguments at many points. But overall, I would say that this literature is characterized by a tendency toward hyperbole, toward counterproductive historical analogies with cases like Weimar Germany, and in general would benefit from a little more consideration and systematic consideration of the contrast cases where democracy is surviving and really doing all right. Then I'm going to get into what we already know in the field about democratic breakdown and authoritarianism. So what are our major baseline theories when we start to look at this problem? My general approach in kind of theory testing and theory building is to be conservative in the sense of looking at what we already have and seeing if it still works, rather than trying to develop a new theory. And in that respect, I'm going to look closely at the theory that Adam Jaworski and Fernando Limongi developed in the 1990s about wealth in countries sustaining democracy, not bringing about democracy, but sustaining democracy, and give that a really close look. Because at first glance, it would appear that countries like Turkey completely blow that theory out of the water. But I think if we look more broadly, we find that it largely holds up. And then I'm going to get into the data that show that. I've put together basically all of the leading data sets on democracy and authoritarianism. So Polity, Varieties of Democracy, Freedom House, Getty's Rights in France. And I've been looking at what they all say together in terms of this problem of democratic breakdown. And I'm going to report on what I've been finding. So that's where I'm headed. To get into the problem as it's discussed in the current literature, is democracy really in trouble? If you look at newsstands in the US or online over the past couple of years, you'll see covers like this. You have major publications, popular publications like Time Magazine, being concerned about authoritarianism. So here's Time from a couple of years ago, and here's Foreign Affairs from last year. These covers and the discussions around them tend to feature the same relatively small number of cases. It's kind of a familiar sort of rogues gallery. Putin often features prominently, but here, of course, we have Erdogan on both covers. And we have Viktor Orban of Hungary and Rodrigo Duterte of the Philippines on both covers. We also have Xi Jinping here. I would say that authoritarianism in China falls outside of the area that I'm covering in this talk, because there we're talking about maybe an evolution of existing authoritarianism. We're not talking about a shift from a competitive multi-party system into something that's dominated by really a single individual. There is a kind of consolidation of power that's been going on around Xi Jinping, and there's a lot of literature on that. But that's not democratic breakdown, because political scientists weren't considering China to be a democracy 5-10 years ago. These other cases, if you looked at the data sets from, like, let's say the year 2000, I think almost all of these cases, including Russia, would have been considered democratic by a lot of political scientists. Today, Turkey and Russia are not considered democratic in the leading data sets. However, actually Hungary and the Philippines still are considered to be democratic. You have examples of kind of, you might say, executive abuse or executives really challenging the rule of law in some ways. But it's interesting to note that in terms of that discrete change from multi-party democracy, where the prospect of the opposition coming to power remains very serious and real, to consolidated authoritarianism, where the opposition really doesn't have a meaningful chance of coming to power, that Hungary and the Philippines, by most of the metrics that are out there, most of the data sets that are out there, remain on the democratic side. And I think that kind of conflation of like Erdogan with Orban speaks to one of the problems in this literature, which largely remains about a kind of hypothetical threat rather than an empirical observed phenomenon. And I would say that the discussion and the hyperbole has ratcheted up significantly after 2016. The US political scientists who are writing about democracy being challenged right now often refer to the Donald Trump presidency as one of the warning signs. And this is a very kind of, it has the potential for being a very presentist and ahistorical attention to questions of democracy and authoritarianism. It's very much kind of a hot take, and so I question what the long-term shelf life of some of these claims will be. But they have birthed a significant and broad literature, including books that have sold quite well on Amazon.com and that are reaching a popular audience. So like Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt's How Democracies Die, featured in the top center here. The Crisis of Democracy by Adam Jaworski and these others. So we have a whole literature about democracy in crisis. I would emphasize that these books really shouldn't be judged by their covers. In many cases, they're more nuanced than their titles indicate. For example, the Can It Happen Here edited volume by Cass Sunstein, I was just using in an undergraduate course this past semester. And it's quite, the authors are quite careful and lucid in their analysis. And generally they answer the question, can authoritarianism happen in America? With no, it's not likely going to happen. And then they go on to say, but here are some areas for concern, mainly in terms of the health and vibrancy and responsiveness of US democracy, rather than actually the rise of authoritarianism. So to an extent, I think this literature wants to have it both ways. It wants to gesture to Weimar Germany and these apocalyptic scenarios of authoritarianism overtaking democracy. But then when the people start actually looking at the evidence, they see that, well, there are really not that many cases to support that kind of a dire prognosis. If any contemporary or additional hook is needed, it's clear from a recent Google search that I did that this is not going away. And if anything, the COVID crisis has amped up the concern about authoritarianism overtaking democracy. And I think in particular, there's been discussion about Viktor Orban expanding his powers, using the COVID-19 public health crisis to expand his powers. So I think this is not going away. My data don't go into 2020, so I don't have data from the current year, and basically they stop at 2018. But I think the findings, if they're robust and if they're sensible, they'll continue to provide some guidance during this time of uncertainty. So to sum up, we have these very prominent examples of authoritarianism overtaking electoral democracy. Besides the ones that I've already mentioned, Nicaragua under Daniel Ortega would be another case. Bangladesh under Sheikh Hasina, I think at this point, is a pretty clear case of democratic breakdown. There's not a serious prospect of the opposition coming back into power in Bangladesh in the near future. And I put an asterisk beside Russia just because although the data sets generally credit Russia as being democratic for a few years, either at some point during the Yeltsin administration or some point early in Putin's administration, Russia, unlike Turkey or Nicaragua or Venezuela or Bangladesh, did not, like post-1991, really did not experience alternation of power between an incumbent party and an opposition party. So to some extent, the Russian case, I think, is less instructive for this problem than some of these other cases. In Turkey, you had different parties coming to power, and so Erdogan consolidating power around himself marked a really radical change. In Russia, there has you didn't have multi-party rotation at the executive level, and you basically had continuity at the executive level, although of course there was a change in the individual who was president. Of course, you all are the experts on that case. So, but in general, there would be a question there about whether that's democratic breakdown or something else. Now, there is a novel aspect to this. There is something that's kind of new and interesting when it does occur, which is that in the past, democratic breakdown and the kind of democratic breakdowns that Juan Linz addressed in his seminal work on the topic happened through the military, happened through coups. Chile, 1973, Argentina, 1976. And they happen relatively quickly. These days, democratic breakdown is more likely to happen through civilian incumbents who consolidate power incrementally and then take the country from multi-party competition into authoritarianism. And this trend appears to be continuing. You do have military coups here and there, Thailand, Mali in 2012, but generally speaking, as I'll show later in the data, when democracies are breaking down, it's happening by civilians, not by generals. And we don't know how, when this is happening, we don't have a good sense, at least from the books and the popular literature that I've referred to, of how widespread the trend is and how representative those cases are. I mean, right now, these prominent examples, we can count them on one hand. Are there more out there that we haven't been paying attention to, or is this relatively infrequent? And in particular, is it infrequent in the circumstances where we would expect democracy to be surviving? Is it infrequent in the wealthy cases, an OECD state like Turkey? We have these counterexamples, not only Ecuador, but Sri Lanka, where you had a president in Sri Lanka that was trying to establish and basically trying to become a president for life, and he was unsuccessful. And these counterexamples merit attention. And then we have cases of backsliding that are still widely deemed democratic. So backsliding, which is really the topic for the next stage of my research, but I'll speak about it briefly today. Backsliding is when you have erosion in democratic constraints on the executive, and you may have some erosions in the rule of law and in protections for civil liberties. So backsliding, I would say, definitely has happened in Hungary, the Philippines, it's happened in Poland, and I guess there's some evidence that it's happened in the United States under Trump. At least the polity data set downgraded the United States from being a 10 to being an 8, something it hadn't done since the Nixon administration. So if you're looking at the data sets, that would be one indicator of backsliding. But backsliding is not breakdown. And a lot of this literature has basically assumed or implied that when you start having backsliding, that you've put the country on a path toward democratic breakdown and authoritarianism. And that's just not the case. I mean, the Nixon administration would be one great historical case to remember. You could have backsliding and kind of erosion of the rule of law and an executive who abused his power, and yet he leaves office peacefully, basically through normal institutional mechanisms, and you continue to have multi-party competition. At this point, we don't know if Hungary is going to end up that way, or if somehow Orban is going to establish an authoritarian regime. Up to this point, he has not done so. So in summary, the variance between democratic breakdown and democratic survival merits more systematic attention. Now, to go from the puzzle to kind of what we know, or how the field tends to think about these problems, I would say, to generalize and distill a rich literature of decades of discussions, I would say we basically have three main schools, or three main epistemological approaches for explaining democracy and authoritarianism. In each of these schools, we can assess in terms of their observable implications. Like, what do they tell us we should see in the world if they are correct? So the first would be the economically oriented material and structural approaches from Seymour Martin Lipset through Barrington Moore on to Jaworski and Lamonji, and there'd be many recent contributors. Carl Bosch would be one of them. This approach says that democracy and authoritarianism is heavily dependent upon the overarching structural conditions in the country, that you don't just make democracy out of whole cloth, and it's not just a matter of actors choosing to have democracy or choosing to have authoritarianism. That generally speaking, wealthier countries are more likely to be democratic, maybe countries with a certain level of inequality or equality, and countries with different certain types of assets that the elites control. For example, Bush has observed that if elites have movable assets instead of fixed assets like land, that they're more likely to adhere to and accept democracy, because if things go awry, they can take their assets, they can liquidate them, they can leave the country. So that would be the material structural approach. Basically, elites are going to work on shaping regimes, but they won't shape regimes in circumstances that they themselves have selected. They are heavily constrained by the material conditions of which they operate. Then at the other end of the spectrum in terms of structure and agency, we have the voluntaristic and agential approaches, starting from Dankwart Rustow's Comparative Politics article on transitions to democracy in 1970, going through the O'Donnell and Schmitter volumes into recent literature. And I would say Milan Zvolik, although he uses a number of different approaches, much of his work would fall in this category. And so what do the voluntarists say? They would say that, especially Rustow and O'Donnell and Schmitter, that authoritarianism and democracy can happen in rich countries, in poor countries, that it's largely a question of the decisions and the interactions that political agents are having. And one of Rustow's cases that he talked about was Turkey. Like, why did you have, when he was writing a multi-party democracy in Turkey, it didn't seem like the structural conditions historically favored that. And O'Donnell and Schmitter were talking about transitions from authoritarianism to democracy, and they said that the structural conditions didn't explain why and how these transitions were taking place in the Philippines in 1986 and in Brazil in 1985. And you suddenly had a number of shifts from authoritarianism to democracy. And their argument was, well, the background conditions can't explain it. It's about what the actors were doing at this particular moment. Then finally, kind of bridging these two schools would be institutional approaches, starting from Sam Huntington, Political Order and Changing Societies, and then a lot of the work in authoritarianism, like Barbara Getty's work on breakdown, Jennifer Gandhi's work. I would probably put I would definitely put my first book in this category. I was arguing that it's political parties that explain how authoritarianism continues, what keeps elites together, how it gives them a longer time horizon so that they're going to be more cooperative instead of fracturing and giving an opportunity to the opposition. So these are the three main schools that we can draw upon in thinking about how much there is a crisis in democracy and why and where democratic breakdown is occurring. I would say that for the most part, the literature has been drawing mostly on the second and third schools, that there's a tendency to have narratives that focus on the chief executives, the decisions they're making, the ways they're undermining rule of law. And this is very much voluntaristic. It's definitely not saying that the wealthy countries are off the hook. And in fact, the kind of anxiety about democratic breakdown that you see in some of the books that I've referenced earlier is very much that this could happen in the wealthiest countries in the world. It could happen in the United States. It could happen in EU countries. And so it very much drawing on the second and third. Plus the narratives they really focus a lot on the personality and the behaviors of the chief executives. So this is very much saying like the power hungry chief executive is able to overthrow democracy, overthrow democratic rules, and establish authoritarianism. So that's kind of where a lot of the mainstream arguments are. And so I'm kind of pushing back on that, or trying to provide some balance to it by focusing and carefully looking at the claims and the theory that Jaworski and Lamonji developed, and then Jaworski, Alvarez, Cheboub, and Lamonji developed in these works from 1997 and 2000. And this is going to be the focus of the remainder of my talk, kind of thinking systematically about Jaworski's claim. Now, many of you, I expect, are familiar with it, but here's a quick recap. Jaworski and his collaborators found that when it came to wealth and democracy, wealth did not bring about democracy, other things did. Basically, democracy comes about exogenously, but then it's not produced endogenously by wealth. So the pattern is strong, the strong pattern is of exogenous democratization. However, wealth sustained democracy once it had been established. One caveat here is they were talking specifically about non-oil wealth, so wealth that doesn't come from rents, especially oil. And in my data analysis later, I will explicitly remove oil wealth from the equation so that I'm consistent with this argument. We have a lot of literature coming out from comparative politics of the Middle East and other regions about how oil wealth and other like hydrocarbon wealth tends to function differently than conventional like agricultural wealth or industrial wealth. So wealth doesn't bring about democracy, but it keeps democracy going. And here's a long, very useful quote from them. The causal power of economic development in bringing down dictatorships appears paltry, but per capita income has a strong impact on the survival of democracies. No democracy has ever been subverted, not during the period we studied, nor ever before nor after, in a country with per capita income higher than that of Argentina in 1975, $6,055, which were at that point in 1999, $1990, I believe. There is no doubt that democracy is stable in affluent countries. The probability of it collapsing is almost zero. Up until 1990, 31 democracies had lived 742 years. That's the total of the country years when you add them together, with incomes above that of Argentina in 1975, and not one had fallen. So I remember hearing Jaworski present this finding when I was in graduate school. And it struck me that for comparativists, this is about as close as we come to something like what international relations scholars have with the democratic peace. A pretty, for those who find it compelling, a pretty rock solid claim that has very important cross-national implications and appears to have few or no exceptions. I mean, the language is so absolute. There is no doubt that democracy is stable in affluent countries. The probability of collapsing, is almost zero. And yet, we have a big challenge at the level of an absolute deterministic relationship. Ko Maeda and Milan Zvolik have written about this. I had a monkey cage piece in 2016 where I wrote about it, and I actually corresponded with Jaworski. I've emailed him on several occasions about this, and he agrees that the relationship doesn't stand up anymore, at least as an absolute one. And it's because of cases like Turkey. Turkey, which in 2016 had a much higher level of wealth than Argentina did in 1975. And yeah, here's a shot from Argentina after the coup, Argentina 1976. And so if Argentina is the baseline and for the theory, then we definitely have exceptions. But the question is, how many exceptions do we have? The Argentina 1975 wealth benchmark may still retain explanatory power in a probabilistic relationship between material conditions and democratic breakdown. So maybe it's not, it's not zero. And even for Jaworski and Lamonji, it was never zero. It was just very, very close to zero. And it may still be a very useful guide. All right, so now let's see what the data tell us. For looking at democratic breakdown, I got to spend a minute describing how I am measuring and operationalizing democracy. It's a very fraught concept in the literature, and I have my own qualms and quibbles with the standard definition, but I'm using it here basically because it's a good way of thinking about the difference between competitive multi-party systems and systems where you do end up with a figure like Erdogan, who has a kind of hegemonic influence over the system, and there's not a meaningful shot at the opposition coming to power. So that's what I mean. Anytime that I say democracy in this talk, you can basically replace it with competitive multi-party systems if you find that language is less loaded and more lucid. And I'm drawing on, of course, the standard Schumpeterian definition. Joseph Schumpeter considered democracy to be an arrangement in which individuals, that is the political elites, acquire the power to decide by means of a competitive struggle for the people's vote. So Schumpeter is very clear. This does not mean rule by the people. It doesn't necessarily mean rule for the people. It doesn't mean that the government is necessarily going to adhere to public opinion. It just means an institutional arrangement in which you've got politicians vying for power, and the main mechanism that determines who gets power is a competitive struggle for the people's vote. So I think that that's useful to underline, because not necessarily in the written literature, but I think sometimes in the popular discourse and just in talks and lectures that people give, there's a tendency to load this minimalist procedural definition of democracy with a lot more significance, to think that democratic countries are somehow more effective at governing, are going to be more responsive to the public than authoritarian governments. That's not necessarily the case. That's an empirical question that would need to be decided separately. The basic definition here is really just about the procedures that are bringing the political decision makers into office. And so breakdown of democracy, one definition would just be, you have a year of democracy, you have a year where you don't have democracy, democracy is broken down. I want to be a little more robust in my analysis than that. So I'm going to define breakdown of democracy as having at least 3 years of democracy continuously, followed by at least 3 years continuously of non-democracy. And what that does is it removes the blips. It removes the cases where a country basically has a long period of, let's say, democracy, and then it has an event, something that happens where it's considered non-democratic for a year or two, and then democracy continues. Those are not the kinds of democratic breakdowns that Juan Linz was concerned about. He was concerned about Germany, about Spain under Franco, about Greece, about these cases that had a pretty established tradition of multi-party democracy, and then they were replaced by autocracy. for an extended period of time. And that's really what I want to speak to. On the flip side, you could also have countries that are basically authoritarian and non-democratic, but then for a couple of years, they're considered democratic by some data set. So for example, Libya, after the 2011 war and after Gaddafi was overthrown, it had elections that initially went fine. And for a couple of years, like I think 2013, 2014, there were some data sets that coded Libya as democratic. Then the civil war really took hold and nobody was coding it as democratic after that point. I don't really think of Libya as a case of democratic breakdown. So that's what I'm screening out here. Even though I'm doing a quantitative approach and I'm looking at a lot of country years and a lot of data, I want to have findings that are externally valid and meaningful for the qualitative literature and for just a common sense understanding of these cases. So I'm not trying to, I don't want to get some finding or result that's kind of artificially generated by a weird coding decision. The data sources here are familiar ones. For economic variables, I use World Development Indicators. For this talk, I'm going to use the democracy country years that are coded by Freedom House dichotomously. So most people are familiar with Freedom House's 1 to 7 scale for civil rights and political rights, or civil liberties and political rights. 1 to 7 scale, 1 is kind of the most free, 7 is the least free. So North Korea every year gets a 7 and 7. Canada every year gets a 1 and a 1. And so that's a continuous variable. And it doesn't really tell us whether or not a country is democratic or authoritarian in a given year. You could have a country that's like a 3-4 that might be considered an electoral democracy, or it might be might be considered to be an electoral autocracy. And so I don't use those. I don't use the 1 through 7s. I use the dichotomous codings, which Freedom House does make available. And those are whether or not a country is considered electoral democracy year to year. And those data go back, well, they go back to 1989, but I kind of worked with them and I extended it back to 1972, which is as far back as the 1 through 7 codings go. And so that's what I'm using in this talk. But in the larger project, I have regime codings from 6 other data sets: Polity, Varieties of Democracy, Boyce, Miller and Rosado, Cheboub, Gandhi and Vreeland, Getty's Rights in France, and Getty's Right in France, and then Magaloni and her co-authors. So we don't have to just stick with Freedom House. We could look at these other data sets. But I can tell you from working with this meta data set that it would not substantively change the findings that I'm reporting today to use Polity instead of Freedom House, or use Varieties of Democracy instead. The total data set covers 172 democratic regime periods. So basically a span of continuous democracy. For example, like Peru in the 1980s would be 1 democratic regime period. Peru after Fujimori in the 2000s would be a 2nd democratic regime period. And it covers 12,200 total country years. Now, here I'm graphing the total number of democracies using the regular Freedom House measure and then using my more robust measure, just to show you kind of the work that it's doing. And also just to spend a moment thinking about the general trend in terms of the growth of democracies over the past 3 decades. So you can see that in the teal coding here, the lower line, this is my robust count of democracy. So if a country hasn't been democratic for 3 years, it's not going to get counted. And you can see it rises basically in parallel with a little bit of a lag, but it rises with the general raw count of electoral democracies. And it stabilizes in around 110 or so. And with some fluctuations in the 2000s, and it has dipped in recent years. But generally speaking, what appears to be a more volatile set of curves in the red graph line, the red plot, is it evens out and it comes back toward the robust line toward the end. So what we're seeing here is basically non-robust democracies falling out. Cases like Libya in 2012, 2013. That's why you would have higher numbers here than the robust line. But generally speaking, we have a strong upward trajectory in the 1990s, and then we have basically a plateau in the 2000s, which I think may be disappointing for many who were exuberant about the 1990s and hoping that more and more countries would become electoral democracies, but may just speak to the long-term structural difficulties in establishing a robust form of electoral democracy. But still, overall, it's certainly we don't observe a dip like back into the levels of pre-1994 or something like that. So keeping this kind of span of time in mind, I'm going to show you in the next slide a different set of plots where we look at not the countries that became democratic or remain democratic, but the countries that have experienced breakdown as I'm operationalizing it. Okay, so here we have in the y-axis we have years. We're just showing the time period here that we're looking at. And then in the x-axis we have the years. And then the y-axis we have we have wealth measured as GDP per capita in constant 2010 dollars, coming from the World Development Indicators. And this is non-oil wealth. So for a country like Venezuela or Russia that has significant oil exports, I've used the World Bank data to calculate what portion of GDP per capita is made up by oil, and I've removed oil from that figure. So if it was 20%, then that 20% chunk gets taken out. Now I've country coded some of the wealthier cases here. This is North Macedonia. This is Thailand, two different democratic breakdowns through military coups. Here's Russia, here's Venezuela, here's Turkey. I've coded the event types with circles for when it's a civilian who's taking over, and inverted triangles for when it's the military. And you can see, as I remarked earlier, that the number of, the number of military coups is relatively small compared to this new and novel form of incumbent takeover, civilian incumbent takeover, which is the majority of the cases. Also, I've color coded here just kind of how long since the democratic breakdown the country has remained authoritarian, and yeah. So what are these cases besides and what's their profile, and what does this say to those three schools and those approaches to democracy and authoritarianism that I mentioned earlier? Well, you can see here in the next slide, I'm going to actually show you the list of cases, but you can already see that overwhelmingly, these are low-income countries. The tendency is that these are low-income countries. Turkey and Venezuela, Russia, the countries that are most likely to be featured on the cover of Foreign Affairs or Time magazine are not representative. They are not typical. And if it was the case, like let's think about observable implications. If it was the case that it's just about executives aggrandizing their power, being ambitious, power hungry, and just overriding the constraints that have been operating on them, regardless of the socioeconomic conditions of the country, and if there was really a spread of democratic breakdown, a resurgence of authoritarianism, then we should see more cases in the upper half of this plot. If it was more of an agential or voluntarist process. We should see wealthier cases doing this, kind of wealthy executives in wealthier countries taking their cues from Erdogan, emulating the Turkish model, and kind of saying like, yeah, I want to be president for life too. And so let me overthrow democracy. And those cases are just not here on the plot. Over the past roughly 3 decades, the major cases have been low-income ones, and oftentimes they have been cases of what you could basically call as recidivism, repeated democratic breakdowns in the same country. So, for example, Haiti, which has had breakdown in 2000, again in 2010. Niger, which had breakdown in 1996, and again in 2016. I've put in italics the cases of that have had repeated breakdowns. And you can see of this, on this table, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 12, 15. Yeah, of these 38 cases, a large number of them are low-income countries or relatively medium to low-income countries. Thailand would be one of the wealthiest, that are experiencing repeated democratic breakdowns. And generally, what we take from these cases is that democracy is not breaking down in OECD countries. It's not breaking down in the wealthiest of, let's say, Latin American or East Asian and Southeast Asian countries. It's tending to break down in lower income countries. And in some cases, it's doing it multiple times as democracy it becomes difficult for democracy to be sustained. So I've shown you in the prior plot where the countries stood in general with respect to levels of wealth. How about with respect to the Jaworski and Lamonji theory, and with respect to Argentina in 1975 in particular? Well, here I've plotted, adjusting for inflation, I've plotted that Argentina GDP per capita. When we adjust for inflation, it's just a little over $7,500. Only 2 of the cases, Venezuela and Turkey, are above the line. Russia is just below it, but Thailand significantly below it, and the other cases are really not even at half the level of GDP per capita that Argentina had when the coup occurred in 1976 against Isabel Perón. So largely, this is a theory affirming pattern. I mean, I was struck by Turkey as a scholar who's worked on Middle Eastern countries, and Turkey is an exception. Turkey does complicate Jaworski and Lamonji's original, very deterministic, absolutist claim that no democracy will fail above the Argentina line. However, it's the exception, not the rule. And same thing for Venezuela. We just see overwhelmingly that democracy is breaking down exactly in the kinds of conditions that Jaworski and Lamonji would have expected. And it's kind of a coincidence, but it's useful to note here that here we have, in terms of the data and in terms of the time span that I'm analyzing, we have here exactly the sequel to Jaworski and Lamonji, because they were looking at 1950 to 1990. Here, we're picking up the story from 1990 through as recently as the data will go. And we see that overwhelmingly it's supporting their theory, not disproving it. I should note here that I've talked about, and the title of this lecture is 1989 to 2018. The reason why I'm stopping in 2016 on this slide and maybe some other slides is because I need that 3-year span to measure robustness. So I need the 2017 and 2018. They are informing the 2016 data, because if the country hadn't remained, let's say if there had been democratic breakdown in 2015, And then 2016, it was undemocratic. But then 2017, 2018, it became democratic again. I wouldn't count it as democratic breakdown. So 2017 to 2018 are in the data, but the most recent year that we can code when we have a kind of a 3-year measure is 2016. Okay, so to wrap this up and turn to your questions, we have a mixed picture that merits balanced and careful consideration. There are cases out there of strong authoritarian leaders that in some cases have basically subverted existing multi-party systems. Turkey is exhibit A. But we also have cases, many in wealthy countries where it's just happening unnoticed, but also in some low-income countries like Ecuador, where executives may have their eye on becoming presidents for life, but they end up stepping down. And in fact, term limits were reinstated after Correa left office, and basically dashing his hopes for coming to power again in a future election. And so there's a lot that we can still take from what Jaworski and Lamandji observed about Argentina. It's true that the military coup aspect, which was what happened in Argentina in 1976, appears to be on the decline, and that authoritarianism these days is more likely to come about through a civilian executive that takes over and undermines the conditions that previously provided for healthy multi-party competition. So that's novel, that's new. More civilians being at the helm of democratic breakdown, and it also is tending to happen in an incremental process rather than in one fell swoop. But generally speaking, there's a lot of continuity. There's a lot that we need to hold on to and continue to apply from prior work. So we have dramatic incumbent takeovers in some states that get a lot of attention, Turkey, Russia, but we have more frequently the exit of elected incumbents through regular processes. Ecuador is one, but I would also say, you know, the jury is still out on Hungary, and definitely on the Philippines. Historically, presidents in the Philippines have had a very difficult time trying to extend their tenure. Marcos did it, but subsequently there have been several chief executives in the Philippines who have wanted to be president for more than one term, but they've stepped down. And even in the case of Hungary, where the opposition appears unable to defeat Orban electorally, I think there's still very much a solid prospect that in the future we could be looking at a picture of Orban, kind of like this picture of Correa, in which he has left office peacefully. So despite the novel shift from military coups, democracy remains the most vulnerable in countries poorer than Argentina in 1975. Oh, well, one thing to say about that, especially for those of us who are not Latin Americanists, and something that I think that the earlier plots convey, but is worth making very explicit. Argentina in 1975, Argentina is a pretty wealthy country. Argentina is, by most measures, the second or third wealthiest Latin American country. So that's something, and I suppose, I mean, you could say that, well, Jaworski and Lamandji found this finding, or they established this finding that a certain level of wealth sustains democracy, but that is a very high bar to clear. So there are a lot of countries out there right now that have that are basically democratic, and some of them have recently moved away from decades of authoritarianism, and they are much poorer than Argentina was in 1975. For example, Tunisia, the only electoral democracy to come out of the Arab Spring. Basically, the last hope for a real long-term shift from authoritarianism to pluralism and a multi-party system is much less wealthy than Argentina was in 1975. So when we're talking about getting over the Argentina threshold, that's a condition, a structural condition that many democracies around the world do not meet today. So to bring this full circle, a question that I'm addressing today and in the larger project is, why are some democracies turning into autocracy while others are surviving and enduring? And in looking at that specific question, I'm most driven by and most interested in this very meaningful shift from long-term democracy to long-term authoritarianism. Is democracy actually breaking down in unexpected places? And how much is this crisis in democracy a real empirical problem for wealthy countries like Hungary, like the United States, as opposed to a hypothetical scenario, as opposed to a kind of, a prognostication of how things might be? And one thing I should say here, I recognize that people will say, well, look, it's so serious even if it's a low probability event, it's so serious if you have long established democracies in OECD countries becoming authoritarian, that even if it's a low probability event, it is of profound concern. And I get that, but I still think that there's a risk of what IR scholars would call threat inflation. And we still need to be careful about making an empirically sound and an evidence-based judgment about the likelihood of these events. And I would say that right now, the likelihood, based on historical data, of democratic breakdown in these wealthier countries still remains very low. So narratives of democratic decline and backsliding are plentiful. And in fact, it's kind of a hard claim to falsify because there's so many different things that can count as backsliding. But actual democratic breakdowns, when the discrete shift from democracy to authoritarianism, remain infrequent. Backsliding does not equal breakdown. And this is what I'm going to be really interrogating in the next stage of my research. The difference between backsliding and breakdown, and whether there is any kind of relationship between them. But I would say so far we do not see evidence for a strong relationship of backsliding even leading to breakdown. Like, again, the US under Nixon, that's by the data sets, that's backsliding. It went from being a 10 to being an 8, and then it went back to being a 10. And there I am going to, I think that's, sorry, a little technical issue here, but okay. And that's what I'll be looking at in my next work. And just to close on this point, I mean, I've been looking at whether or not, just this past week, I've been running some regression analyses on whether or not backsliding predicts breakdown. So whether or not, if we put backsliding in a regression as an explanatory variable, whether it is significantly correlated with the occurrence of democratic breakdown. And I found no statistically significant relationship. And the GDP per capita variables remained the strongest predictor of breakdown. So thank you for your attention, and I will, I will stop there. I'm happy to take questions, and I thought I had one more. Oh, there we go. Okay, let me go back to sorry, I'm not.
We have a couple of questions in the chat. First, it's from Nikati Berg, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. You can see it in the Zoom chat, and another one from YouTube channel. I will just copy paste it in the chat.
So I don't have any. Sorry, I don't have any Zoom chat open, but I can. Maybe if you instruct me, I can make it visible to me. Right now, all I see is my my lecture slide, which is in full screen mode, and then I see the participants' names, and in some cases the headshots.
Give me just.
Jason, may I help you? May I try to help you? There is a question, or rather a comment, from Nekati Berk from Turkey.
Okay.
And here is the question. Hello, Professor. Turkey has been an authoritarian country since it has been founded. So how can a democratic breakdown in Turkey if it never happened in the first place? I guess you call a leader an authoritarian when he or she doesn't collaborate with West, especially USA. For example, a military coup recently happened in Egypt, and you don't mention about him because USA supports him and he collaborates with USA.
Okay, right. Yeah, so I think I'm very sympathetic to some of the ideas behind the question, because I think there can be a tendency in political science to judge countries and measure countries based on their foreign policies rather than based on their domestic institutions and practices. And Ido Oren is someone who's written a lot about this. Basically, when a country cooperates with, let's say, the United States, then US political scientists will say you're democratic. When it's not cooperating, they'll say it's authoritarian. So I think that actually, and when this comes out as a paper, or if you look at the data set, that I don't think this project is susceptible to that criticism. I'm well aware of that problem. I've actually looked critically at the US relationship with Egypt. I've talked and written extensively about how the United States supports authoritarianism in Egypt. And let me talk about Sisi in Egypt, and then I'll come back to Turkey. So in the case of the coup in Egypt in 2013, I would say that, yes, that was a coup that overthrew a democratically elected government. Morsi had only been in power, Mohamed Morsi had only been in office for a year at that point. So Egypt did not really have the time to show up as a well-functioning democracy before the coup. And so that does not get counted as a case of democratic breakdown. But I take your point that it would be useful for the project to consider some of these shorter-lived democratic experiences and make sure that they don't get neglected. With respect to Turkey, the political science literature that I'm speaking to is drawing the line between authoritarianism and democracy based on this procedural definition of multi-party competition. And by that metric, the transition from Ataturk's original party to opposition parties coming to power with the DP in 1950, I believe, marked the beginning of multi-party democracy in Turkey. It's been interrupted on several occasions through military coups, but when Erdogan came to power, it was considered a multi-party democracy. And when the AKP was in power, including when it was denying the US the option to move troops into Iraq, into northern Iraq through Turkey, it was being considered a democracy. So I think, at least in terms of the way I'm coding things, if I was really just looking at Turkey when it was cooperating with the US and saying that's democratic, and then saying it's authoritarian now because because Erdogan is somehow, in some cases, asserting his preferences over US preferences, that the codings would look quite different. I also would say that, yeah, I mean, the AKP was, and generally speaking, Islamist parties around the Middle East that are outside of the kind of Wahhabi Saudi tradition are generally not the ones that U.S. officials want to see come to power. So definitely I guess I'm in agreement with you on that in terms of the attitude of U.S. officials, but my coding is not following what the people in Washington are, may or may not want in a given capital. There are many people in Washington who might think Sheikh Hasina in Bangladesh is a democratic leader because Bangladesh is being very helpful for the United States and India. But I'm saying at this point, Sheikh Hasina is not a democratic leader, that Bangladesh has experienced an incremental form of democratic breakdown.
Thank you. I think the question from Farkan Firatli.
Hi, can you hear me? Right.
I hear you.
Yes, we can.
I'm also from Turkey, and
Okay.
I have actually it's more of a comment rather than a question. Very recently, I conducted a research on Turkish labor market about the occupational change and polarization in Turkey. It is what we try to find actually the vanishing middle income in Turkey thanks to technology and increasing employment share in the lowest income and the highest income in Turkish labor market. But what is empirically striking is actually the Turkish labor market is polarizing. People are moving either to lowest income group or the highest income group. But actually the jobs provided in the highest income group mostly provided by the government. And the research conducted between 2005 and 2018. So basically it is the AKP government, Erdogan was in charge and he still right now. So the institutional role in the Turkish labor market tells us that. So the 80% of the highest income group in Turkey actually employed in public sector. And it is the highest income group. So imagine that you are a newly graduated student and you enter into the labor market. You have two options basically. You will either go to the lowest income group, which is actually even below the minimum wage, or you will go to the highest income group. And the highest income group, 80%, mostly public officers. So scientifically speaking, I cannot claim that, okay, nepotism plays the role and the government only offers the job to people who supports them. But it is a certain fact that actually the 80% is only provided by the public sector. So actually my question is regarding to Argentinian line. So, okay, it is easy for cross-country analysis. It is easy to compare countries according to GDP per capita. But actually maybe we need to dig into structural, how economy is structured. So for example, the labor markets, because actually the distribution of wealth actually explains the rent seeking, rent distribution, and the buying votes. So intuitively speaking, for Turkey case actually, so why people would support authoritarian leader is actually the answer in the labor market. Right. Because if you don't support the government, so otherwise you will end up in the lowest income group. But through the nepotism, actually, you might be in the highest income group. This is how Erdogan get the 51% of the vote. So
yes. Okay, so I think that's a great point on several levels. I mean, one of the things that's interesting about these cases of democratic breakdown is that, and the start of authoritarianism, is that oftentimes the leaders are popular. I mean, the leaders do have some meaningful constituency. And it's not that they only could get 10% of the vote in an election. In many cases, they could get a majority, and yet they still skew the playing field even further against their opponents. What you've been describing, I think, is a very important area for me to be looking at in the next stage of work. And it's reminding me about some stuff that's been done on Hungary and done on how Orban has managed to maintain support. And basically why, in many cases, I mean, Orban has not been as coercive as Erdogan, and he's just been able to outmaneuver the opposition with elections that are still basically meeting international standards. But yeah, very much this kind of political economy of support, of popular support for the executive.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Here is the question from Israel Marquez. Israel.
Yes.
Hey.
I'm assuming my equipment's working.
You're good. I see you. Yes.
Okay. So I guess I had a more of a question than a comment, but it turns out to be highly related. So I remember sort of one of those classic memories of graduate school, reading the Przeworski and Lamanji, and I remember sort of finishing it and having to hold myself back from throwing the thing through my window. Not because I thought it was wrong, but just one of the most, the things that I found sort of deeply unsatisfying about that book and about many of the structural theories, not all, is precisely something that Furkan touches on, which is the mechanism by which it works, right? So like it's sort of frustrating because they're like, here's some level of income, and above this it's fine, below this, you know, it's less fine. But I think particularly when we try to get past treating this as a deterministic law and thinking about this as a probabilistic theory, it becomes quite important to think through the mechanisms. And so that's actually what I wanted to ask you. Is this, is it possible to sort of speculate, to think about, you know, why it is the case that income sort of consolidates democracy, A, and B, you know, one of the things that I feel like we worry about democratic breakdown is particularly this question of the lag structure, right? So, you know, the democracy breaks down in the Nixon era. There's a couple years of that, but then it's fine. In Hungary's case, something similar. But one wonders if the nature of the breakdown erodes something fundamental that is crucial for making sure that income then translates into democracy, if that makes sense. And so, you know, both as a question of like, what could that mechanism be, but also as I think something that would be incredibly valuable for your work moving forward, would be specifically to think about this mechanism and to think about what we would expect to see if it breaks down. And I also wonder if maybe, as much as, you know, looking at exceptional cases can be a canard, I wonder if there's not something we can look at in the Turkish and Venezuelan cases to help us sort of speculate or to understand what this mechanism would be in a way that we could then systematically test. Thank you.
Yes, yes. So I would say, thank you for the question. I would say that definitely mechanisms are something that we all need to explore, that I need to explore in this project. My quick answer would be that wealth, higher levels of wealth, means more influential countervailing forces at the elite level that can prevent an authoritarian leader from consolidating power around them. But I think what Furkan had said in his question kind of also speaks to this, which is that maybe what has happened in Turkey, or what has happened in Venezuela, and what could happen in other wealthy countries, is that you get off the normal path some way, in which wealth is generally being distributed among countervailing sets of elites. You undermine one set of elites, or you undermine maybe multiple sets of elites, and you're able to have a wealth distribution that really clusters in one faction, and then that makes the political system more lopsided. So that would be basically, in terms of the mechanisms, what I would be interested in exploring, or what I would suggest as a hypothesis for why wealth in some cases would be translating into more political pluralism, but in other cases could coincide with hegemonic control under one leader, one faction.
Thank you, Jason. It's Akim Marbatli. Akim.
Hello.
Hello. Hi.
So I also happen to be from Turkey, so we're pretty crowded today. Well, my question is not directly related to that, but what I tend to see in all these cases of breakdown, Turkey and Venezuela and partially Russia I study, but others as well, Hungary, and even you could make the same argument for US, is the rise of political polarization in all of these cases, and sort of the division of the society into these two hostile camps. So rather than treating these cases as exceptions, which they are, I mean, I also agree that Venezuela and Turkey seem to be exceptions to the rule. But again, Israel talked about mechanisms. Do you think one of the mechanisms could be the extent of political polarization in these countries, which make the society unable to both follow up on the sort of democratic values front and to sort of fail to support the democratic institutions? So that's one mechanism that I would offer and one that I'm sort of fixated on. The other thing is, this is more of a comment, I guess. You talk about non-oil wealth and sort of how that affects democratic breakdowns, but people who come from the oil politics studies would immediately tell you that oil does not only produce wealth, but it changes the economic structure of societies as well. So, right, can we say that, okay, I've now removed this portion of wealth from Russia or Venezuela, and now it became comparable to Argentina or Turkey? So I would sort of have a problem with that argument, I guess.
Yes, so let me take that. Thank you for the questions. I'll take the second one first. Yeah, so Jaworski and Lamonji and then in the 2000 book with the other co-authors, they just completely set oil-rich countries aside. And I find that to be kind of a dodge. That's like a way to escape falsification. But I agree with you that it can have a kind of qualitative impact on the economy overall. And so it would be worthwhile to, to talk about, well, if we just exclude the oil-rich countries, or if I have a dummy variable for if you've got 20% more or more of your income from oil wealth, then we'll test that dummy variable in addition to having it removed from GDP per capita. And then
inequality in some way, to introduce inequality into the equation in some way might work to mitigate the problem, at least, because oil does create economic inequality as well, right?
Yes, I could look at it. I can also add inequality. I tend to try to be, as might come across in the structure of my talk, I tend to be try to be parsimonious, and then I begrudgingly add new variables when I'm forced to. But because I kind of want to see how far we can go with a parsimonious approach. But of course, if we excluded oil-rich cases, then Venezuela would not be an exception. It would just not be in there. I'm not sure about where Russia would stand at that point, but probably it wouldn't be on the grid either. With respect to political polarization, I kind of can see this going a couple of different ways. If you have the kind of polarization, or at least, let's say, fragmentation of parties that you have in Hungary, where it's kind of the incumbent party is sort of center-right, and then the opposition is either far right or center-left and left, and you can't get the far right and the left to get together to oust the incumbent, then I could see political polarization contributing to a concentration of power in an executive. In the United States, I've actually felt like, I mean, I don't love it. I would like a government that got more done, especially for Americans that really could benefit from a solid welfare state. But I see the political polarization as impeding the chance for an individual to consolidate power. I mean, when there was something, I forget exactly what was going on in February, but it was before COVID, and I was was teaching about, or maybe it was last fall, but I mean, just the dysfunction of the White House and then what Congress was doing. I guess it was the whole like impeachment thing. I was like, this is a mess, but it's not authoritarianism. I mean, you don't have a Congress impeaching the president, and just, you don't have that kind of Pelosi versus Trump dynamic in the kinds of incremental democratic breakdowns that I've been talking about today. So if that I don't know what the situation was like in Turkey in the different elections as Erdogan and the AKP kept winning, but I mean, in some cases it was a pretty close call, and I think if the opposition had been a little more unified, he could have been stopped early on. But I would definitely say in the U.S., and maybe it's just a product of having the first past the post system that contributes to a two-party system, that the polarization would tend to reduce the likelihood of an executive being able to take over.
Okay, so you're saying polarization would actually help democracy?
Yeah, I'm saying it. I don't know if it helps the functioning and of democracy and the health of democracy and kind of the policy outcomes that we might want, but I think it inhibits the executive from taking over. It makes it much less likely.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Jason.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions or comments?
Yeah, there is one more question from the YouTube channel. Why do you consider Hungary as a backsliding case?
Oh, because of moves like shutting down or just I think that removing the accreditation of Central European University, and generally speaking, taking the country in the direction of less respect for civil liberties. In saying that, though, in saying it's a case of democratic backsliding and not breakdown, I'm not going as far as a few political scientists out there like Larry Diamond, who already, he said last year in his book Ill Winds, Hungary is no longer a democracy. So but I would say that it fits the definition of democratic backsliding, in which you have executives expanding their powers, manipulating the rule of law. I mean, so like one of the things that Orban does to undermine the opposition that's basically legal is he gets his friends to buy out opposition newspapers and then basically run them into the ground and shut them off. So he has exerted a control over the media that abides by the law, but qualitatively limits the ability of the opposition to communicate a message other than the government's. So that's what I mean by democratic backsliding. I do see a hand up from Nikita Zubarev.
I don't see this, but please.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. You said that you will continue working in this direction, of course, but do you already have some data on the relationship between democratic backsliding and wealth?
Yes, I have data on democratic breakdown as the dependent variable, with backsliding and wealth as independent variables. And I see wealth that has emerged like immediately as the most significant, like 0.0000. It's like very highly significant correlation between wealth and democratic breakdown. And backsliding was not significant in that model. So, but I will be looking at backsliding as a dependent variable and examining the relationship of wealth. But I don't think that I'll find a strong relationship between wealth and backsliding, mainly because if you start actually looking at backsliding globally instead of cherry picking cases, it's all over the place. I mean, like I already mentioned, the US case under Nixon, but Great Britain, occasionally has times when it gets like downcoded for a few years. Now, some of the backsliding people may say, oh, well, that's not really backsliding. But then I would kind of question them, like, well, how are you going to measure it in a regular and valid way across cases? So generally speaking, I would say breakdown is infrequent. It's associated with wealth. Backsliding is commonplace, and it could be associated with all kinds of conditions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, guys, let me say thank you very much, Jason, for an optimistic conclusions and for a very important presentation, which will be helpful for us and for our students. And let me say that I very much hope that next time we meet offline and we meet at HSE.
Yes.
Thanks a lot.
I hope so too. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.